Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to St Vincent's Hospital and to this Convergence Science Network event. My name is Luan Ismail. I'm the convener and executive director of the network, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here this evening. In conjunction with one of our valued partners, St Vincent's Hospital, we're organising this conversation, this panel discussion during Clinical Trials Awareness Week. So we're going to have a very interesting and thought-provoking conversation. Of course, these events wouldn't be possible without the support of our partners, and I thank them and our supporters for making these events possible. It's now my pleasure to invite Dr. Tan Nguyen from St Vincent's Hospital, Executive Officer of Research. Tam?
Great. Well, thank you, Learn, for the introduction. So welcome to St Vincent's. So it's really a great pleasure to be part of the Convergence Science Network and to organise this inaugural, really a public lecture talking about clinical trials. And as you will see in a few moments, in terms of hearing from trial participants, researchers involved in trials, the good, the bad, and the ugly aspects, although hopefully it's not too many ugly parts. Before we actually introduce our facilitator, I just want to sort of also thank our team. So Brenda Lee, who's our Clinical Trial Liaison Officer, and Malachi Turan, who's our event intern, been sort of helping out behind the scene as well. So thanks, guys. Needless to say, Michelle Gallagher is a friend of St V, and she's been work in sort of the biotech startup, in research in hospitals and research organisation and pharmaceutical companies. She's now the creative director of the Social Science, an organisation that works to pretty much transform science and technology, executive and organisation from sort of in the journey of social media. And you see there, she also a trial participant. I'll leave that for Michelle to talk about that. So Michelle, welcome, and if I could ask all the panelists join us at the front.
Thank you much, Tam. My name is Michelle, and I'm going to facilitate this discussion tonight. I have worked around clinical trials all of my career. I started in the field of ophthalmology and got out of a clinical role to get into a clinical trial role, which was the beginning of my journey in a pharmaceutical and biotech industry career. Till recently, I'd not had a lot to do with clinical trials, but I was the chief executive of the Biotechnology Industry Association here in Victoria for some years. So I used to stand on a stage frequently and talk about how valuable the clinical trial system was in Victoria, and that more pharmaceutical companies and biotech companies should come to Victoria to do their trials. We had a great hospital system, we had great companies, we had great trial participants. And then as I went into social media more and more, I could see the transformational power of social media around clinical trials, and it was a wonderful crossroad that was approaching. In having this discussion today, one of the most important things I've probably done in my life was volunteer as a healthy volunteer for a clinical trial. So I signed up for an Ebola vaccine study that was being run out of the Centre for Clinical Studies at the Alfred. And the first thing I did after signing up, I went home and I said to my family, this is what I've done. And for the very first time in my life, I had a huge fight with my sister-in-law. And she was devastated that I'd done this. She said, you're a mother and you have children and you own your own business. What if something goes wrong? You shouldn't be doing this. You should leave it up to somebody else. So I'm going to kick off the discussion here tonight on that note. And first of all, I want to introduce to you our panel. And to my right here is Leanne. Leanne's been a trial participant, and we'll get her to tell her story in a minute. Next to her is Emma. Emma's a clinical trial coordinator. So she's one of the healthcare providers and one of the participants of the planning process that gets trials together. On the other side of her, we've got Catherine, who's also a clinical trial participant. And I should add that both Leanne and Catherine are still in their clinical trial. We'll get them to talk about that. On the other side, to the right of Leanne, is Wendell. Wendell is a neurologist. And he's going to talk about it from the healthcare provider's point of view and what it feels like from his perspective. And at the very far end is Jackie, and Jackie is a hospital ethics committee member. She's a lay member. And this is a really critical role to have people, members of our public, involved in making decisions around clinical trials. So first of all, I'm going to start with you, Leanne, because you're on my right here. And so that puts you in the hot seat. You're in the hot seat. And first of all, let's talk about the experience. And just before we do that, could you raise your hand in the audience if you've been a participant in a clinical trial, either as a healthy volunteer or in a phase 2 or a phase 3 study? Right, it's a pretty small number, and that's interesting because I'm going to throw out a number here. About 3% of cancer patients participate in clinical trials in Australia. And even though the population is ageing and we're seeing more and more incidents or diagnoses of cancer, why is it that only 3%? And in this room, we've probably got a little more than 3%, but it's certainly not 10%. So why did you participate in a clinical trial, Leanne? What was your motivation?
Well, I'll start with this isn't the only clinical trial I've done. I've lost track of how many clinical trials I've done.
You're a serial trialist.
I'm like the favourite research guinea pig. I have type 1 diabetes, and I'll go back to your sister-in-law's question, leave it to someone else. Who else?
Yeah.
We're a really small population. I've had type 1 diabetes for 36 years. If it's not me, who else can do these trials? A lot of type 1 patients are children or they have other commitments. There's only a small population, and certainly with the trial I'm currently involved with, which is using a augmented, almost closed loop insulin pump. Does anyone know what an insulin pump is? Hands up.
A few? A lot.
Hey. I've been using an insulin pump for a really long time, so I know how to use it. I've been using sensor augmentation, which is using continuous glucose monitoring to provide input to my pump, and it does certain things, but there's still a lot of manual process. There's now a next stage where it's going to do a little bit more of the work for patients, still needing patient input. So the trial people actually need people who are savvy, who are committed. This is a 6-month-long trial with multiple visits. I think there's at least 20 visits in this. If I don't do it, who will, and how do we get the benefits? I'm really keen to see this stuff come into play because I know how much this technology has changed my life and my health, but I'm not going to sit back and wait for someone else to do it.
Not everybody feels the same way though. Not everyone's maybe as altruistic as that. But there must have been direct benefits for you. Have you seen benefits to your health or benefits to being able to access new technologies that are not yet on the market?
Yes and no. So this trial with the piece of equipment that I'll be trialling, once the 6 months is over, I don't get it. I don't get to keep it. It goes back and we wait for approval through TGA. So I'll be sitting back and waiting for a couple of years. It's a randomised trial. I don't even know whether I'm going to get it or get to stay on my own current treatment. So there's no benefit in this for me. In fact, it costs me. But I hope that in a couple of years' time it will be available on the market. Previously, I might have got a bit of equipment here or there. There's not a lot of benefit. For me, it really is the altruistic. I want to see this happen because, you know, if I think back to my 11-year-old newly diagnosed self, and if I had have known the journey that I would be on, knowing that things would change, it's only through people putting their hand up and saying, I'm up for that, I'll give it a shot.
That's terrific. Catherine, can I come to you now? Tell me, you're, what, about 8 weeks into your trial now?
Yes.
Yeah, and what motivated you? What was the reason why you said yes, and how were you propositioned to go into the trial?
I was at the end of, I guess I didn't really have anywhere else to go with medication, really, or wasn't having much success, and was looking at surgery options, and then that wasn't looking particularly optimistic, and then I can't remember, surprise. Yeah, my neurologist referred me to Emma and Mark because a trial had come up pretty much at the same time as we were shutting down the surgery option.
Good timing.
It was very good timing, and it was no irony, no-brainer. I didn't really even give it a second thought.
So your family, were they delighted when you said,
Oh my
this
God,
is what
my
I'm going to do?
dad was like,
Yeah.
he didn't even read the paperwork. Like,
Did he?
Just sign,
Don't
sign
tell
it
him
up.
that. Consent.
Yeah. I'm like,
Yeah.
Dad, you should probably read the paperwork on my behalf,
Yeah.
at least. But no, there wasn't really any options, and I felt really confident in my neurologist, for one, but also that that it couldn't be any worse than my current situation, and that we'd had, she hadn't gone very far at that stage, no, there wasn't any actual evidence that it was going to work at that stage, but I think I was just ready to try anything. So
Yeah. So 3 very different reasons, I think, for saying yes to a trial in the space of 5 minutes. Are we doing well, Tam? Do you like that so far? That's good. Wendell, can I jump to you now as a healthcare provider? And I think Catherine gave us a really good segue in that comment. It was proposed to her by her oncologist, is that right? Neurologist, thank you. That she entered the trial. And this is an obvious way that we get patients into trials. How does it sit with you? Because that's a significant undertaking from a healthcare provider to be a trialist. And is it right that we still rely on, I guess, the specialist to make the recommendation?
I mean, it's how it usually happens that, as doctors, and particularly in a tertiary hospital, we work here because they're the trickiest patients to look after and to manage. And, so it's easy for us as well to be involved in trials because, we have often no options for our patients when, the longer you're in the business of health and medicine, the more patients you accumulate that, are stuck with the existing treatments not working. And, just say, for example, in epilepsy where I work, 30% of patients don't respond to treatments and have significant impact on their lives. So for us, it's we have to be involved in trials because we have patients have no access to the latest and best and experimental treatments as well. And I think and I'm impressed by the first speaker by being so altruistic, because one of the things we do as a trial, and I run a regulatory trial service, is that we make sure that for drug trials that the companies have to give it to the what we call the placebo arm, the arm that doesn't get the active drug for the active period of time when people don't know which they're on, the active drug or the placebo drug. And we don't get involved in those sorts of trials unless the patient can get it at the end of that time. So they're blinded and don't know which one they're getting, but then at the end of that time they get the drug. And then we also stipulate quite strongly that they in fact have to have that drug until it's listed in Australia. And we don't get involved in trials unless they do that. So it gives our patients an access to the latest and best medications, or potentially best medications, before other people get it.
Do you think it makes a significant difference to you as a specialist, and thinking about maybe your younger self or the young neurologists that are coming up behind you? How important is it that we get younger specialists to put their hand up and say, yeah, I want to be involved in a trial? What does it give the medical profession to have a good trial system here in Victoria?
Look, I think we always encourage all our younger and upcoming doctors to be cognizant of these trials available, but they're becoming busier and busier, and so constantly reminding them that there are these options available. And look, if your patient isn't responding to this, think about this trial. These are available, and so we're constantly doing that, and that's the challenge, because they are referred by their doctor, and as the panelists have said, they trust their doctors, and in fact it's often us that are saying, look, we need to tell you everything, all the risks in this study before you sign it. And they're saying, come on, I just want to sign up, and go, no, I have to go through this. So we are kind of the doctor and the advocate in some respects as well, which look, it doesn't make me uncomfortable to be that, because the patients that are involved, they have no other options, you know.
That's true. One of the frightening statistics that I've got here is that, and it's from Covance, that many trials fail to enrol a single patient. Up to 60% of oncology trials don't get a single patient. And the cost of that means an increased cost of the drug once a drug finally gets through that pathway. So thinking about the rising cost of pharmaceuticals, the rising cost of clinical trials, and it comes down to one thing: it's the ability to recruit and to plan well for that process. And this is where I'm going to jump to you, Emma, because you're very involved in the planning process, and you would see there's good trials and there's probably not so well planned trials. One of the hurdles we've been talking about right now is recruitment. We'll get into the process of trials in a minute. But what do you think the biggest barrier to recruitment is? Because you would see trials that fail to recruit every year.
You're right. Probably staff being on board is a big one that I've come across. There's a whole heap of very supportive team members that I work with, but some along the way don't see the point in what you're doing, don't really want to be involved, therefore don't want their patients involved because they don't want to know about it and they're not interested about it.
Do you think it's the administrative burden, or just they're overwhelmed, they don't have time to keep up with new drugs, you know, meeting opportunities,
Bit of both.
teaching?
Bit of both.
Yeah.
I'd say all of that, like teaching, keeping up with it. And also it depends where they are in their career as well. I've found that a couple that are coming towards retirement, they kind of just don't want to know about it so much.
Oh, really? I was going to tag it the other way, actually. I
That's
thought,
my
oh, no,
experience.
they'll be going... So are we saying that younger healthcare providers are more likely and...
Yes and no.
Yeah?
Yeah, I'm a bit split on that one as well. I've definitely got some great young ones coming through who are very gung-ho on research and are coming up with new inventive ideas left, right and centre, and can't wait to get a lot of things off the ground. And then there's just other ones that like to sit back and continue to progress their career but aren't so interested in research at that time.
So maybe we just have to make clinical research as a label very, very sexy.
Yeah.
Make them love it. It's interesting because surely it makes a difference as healthcare providers are going through their various training and allied health and all the rest of it.
Absolutely.
The more we can talk about the opportunity around clinical trials as a career opportunity, but also this is how new technologies get developed. It's understanding that pathway is a big part.
Absolutely.
What about from the patient's perspective? You see patients when they front up and they get a look at that consent form and they go, oh, 8 injections. Oh,
Well,
okay.
again, there's two sides. So, like patients like Catherine, who have no options left, essentially, who are at their wits' ends. They've tried everything else, and they can't wait to sign that consent form.
So you've got to hold them back a bit.
You've got to hold
Sometimes
them
have
back
to
a
put the
bit,
reins
especially
on.
like Catherine's dad.
Especially
He
Catherine.
just wanted
Yeah.
to get in there and get going. It was great.
I love Catherine's dad. I think we need him in the advocacy campaign for clinical trials. But that's actually a very important point, isn't it? Because this comes to the heart of what informed consent is, but it's understanding both the risks and the benefit. Yeah.
Absolutely. So, yeah, no, we've got patients that are very excited and can't wait. And then there's the other side of things where we've got patients who are trying to deal with what they've come in with in the first place. Say it's a new diagnosis of something. And you come at them and go, oh, well, at the same time, would you consider this? And they get very overwhelmed trying to take on too much at once. As easy as you might put it to them and things like that. But yeah, they're the two types that I seem to come across. More so the ones that don't have many options left, and they're always generally willing to give it a go. Sometimes it's the family you'll get resistance from. Obviously they want the best for their family member, and if it's experimental, they don't trust that. Then there's others who go, well, what else do we have to give it a go? If it gives you time, I'm happy with that.
What do you think about his success stories? And the one I'm thinking of is Ron Walker with Keytruda. And so here he goes, and he's standing up, and he looks as well as he was maybe 20 years ago with a bit of Botox. but it's important, those success stories. But on the flip side, we also have the not so successful stories, and they're devastating for the sector, aren't they? You must really feel when you see stories like that in the media,
Yeah.
both the good and the bad, the unrealistic expectations, and then the reaction to a very bad trial. How it's presented really matters.
Big point. You know, you see things even lately on the news, and I go, you've missed a key point.
Yeah.
And what you've put across, which can make clinical trials look terrible, but can make us look amazing at the same time.
I think we all say that in the health and medical research profession. Whenever we see a journalist, we sort of do a bit of a face slap every now and then, don't we? Jackie, I'm going to jump to you. Let's talk about ethics and your role. And I'm not sure if everybody in the audience understands what you do. Would you mind just putting that into a bit of a nutshell?
Well, I've only been on for about 5 months, but my understanding is there's a group of 4 of us amongst the professional researchers and the clinicians in the room, and we all read through the ethics of the trials, and we look at it from my perspective and from the other lay people in the room. We look at it from a lay person's point of view, and we look at the wording, we look at how consent is given, we look at the amount of time that is being asked, and we look at what's unrealistic, where have researchers perhaps have lost touch with what really happens out there in the real world, and things like, you know, is 7 hours with spending a day at a hospital per month for a period of time, is that too much to ask? What other things are they considering? So I guess consider that common sense touch of just saying, pull it back, let's just have a look at it from an everyday person's point of view, and finding that sweet spot of, have we got enough information? Can people make informed choice, know what that informed consent is about, and making sure that people understand, and there's a sort of a healthy discussion around it. We don't always have to understand the science, that's why we have lots of people in the room who explain it to us. But it takes a long time to do, but it's extraordinarily interesting and rewarding.
So why did you do it?
I was just really interested, and I'd sit at another smaller community health services ethics committee, and I wanted to take a bigger step, and it was being advertised, so I applied. I think after my first meeting I deeply regretted that, because I just did not realise how big a reading it was, but I've managed to get my head around it now, which is great.
So would you recommend it to other people?
Absolutely. To anyone who is out there who is thinking about doing it, put your hand up, give up a Sunday each month and do it.
It strikes me as interesting because we often, when we talk about Volunteer Week, we don't often talk about clinical trials in the same sentence, do we? But you can see straight away from a healthcare provider's point of view, there's a lot of volunteer hours. It's not just the obvious hours that I think doctors and clinical trial nurses and participants all put in. But it seems like this is probably one of the biggest volunteer opportunities or landscapes that we've got in this country, and I hope it gets bigger. I want to talk now about the technology that's impacting on clinical trials, and I made mention in my opening my interest is in social media, and Facebook is becoming a huge recruiting tool, but also it's technologies such as video, the idea of remote clinical trials that come to you. How do we get people in remote and regional areas to participate in clinical trials? And Wendell, I'm going to jump to you. What do you think about the idea of technology, and how could we potentially use technology to make trials easier? Have you tried anything that you could recommend?
I'm glad you asked me this question, actually, because it's one of my sort of bugbears actually about it. You know, I in fact do most of my works in rural and remote regions, so 80% of my work's in northwest Tasmania, and it used to be in the Goulburn Valley, but now it's primarily in Tasmania. And one of the reasons I go there because of access to health services in those regions. And I do telehealth there now, as the government has slowly eroded my fly in, fly out. So I'm almost exclusively telehealth to rural and remote regions. And I struggle because obviously they have lots of patients there, or people that I see there, that are not well controlled either, and they can't access trials. So I've got people knocking at my door, trying to get into trials, but they can't do it. So I think this is one of the big areas that we should try and embrace, to try and somehow embrace telehealth. And you know, Australia's such a huge country where you can't fly everywhere, or you can't come anywhere as well. You know, it's hard to get to Metropolitan Hospital, let alone all the parking and other issues that happen with that. So this would be an ideal space to have trials in, I think.
What about you, Leanne? What do you think of that, the idea of technology in trials? When we've, and Catherine as well, we've got to front up to hospitals and we've got to go through the parking and the hours and surely you work, you've got a job. It's not just being a trial participant.
That'd be nice.
Wouldn't it be nice?
If it paid. But no, I have to work and pay the bills.
But yeah, I mean, this is probably a game changer if there was technology that would make it so much more convenient.
Yeah, I certainly think if there was the capacity to be able to do certain elements of trial, either via video conference, so I have components, the recent trial that I'm doing, need to have my carb counting calibrated and make sure that I'm doing all of that right, which required a visit to a dietitian. If I could have done that over the phone, providing information, providing photographs, there's so many ways it could have been done rather than a face-to-face visit that would have meant I wouldn't have had to take time off work, parking, driving to the site where I had to go, which is away from my usual workplaces. So I certainly think e-health and how we could use that in trials is a really exciting sort of opportunity that we're not really embracing a lot at the moment.
What about you, Emma? Do you see that as the future of clinical trials? How would that change the perspective for you and your colleagues working in a site?
It would help recruitment
Yeah.
exponentially. Like I get a lot of emails and phone calls from interstate people that only one particular trial that they can possibly go on is run in Melbourne, but these people live in Perth or Queensland somewhere and they are desperate, but it's the commitment of flying and whatnot. And we have a huge country base of patients, like majority of patients on Natalie's trial, Catherine's trial, sorry, for us are all country patients, and the hours that they have to put in travelling by car is phenomenal just to get a once a week visit for us. And I think e-health would definitely lessen the burden for the patients and their families.
The other thing I was thinking too about is language and the barrier of language, that we have a huge part of our society here in Victoria speaks a language other than English. And surely we're not getting nearly enough representation of people from other ethnic backgrounds. And that's what makes a trial sector great, is about that mix of ethnic backgrounds and opportunities there. But also I'm thinking about our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. They're woefully represented. How does somebody like, I guess, St Vincent's, how do they potentially access a different sort of community to give greater diversity in trials?
That's a challenge with sponsors as well.
Is it really? Yeah.
Some of the inclusion criteria is that they want English-speaking people aged between this age and this age, and that's it.
But do you think that's because of the barrier of technology, that if we had technology that could translate effectively, cost-effectively, and in the moment, potentially, or if you had, as Wendell was saying, the remote and rural communities, we really must be ensuring that we stretch the opportunity into those regions, not just Albury, Wodonga or Shepparton or Geelong, but Broken Hill and getting up to Tennant Creek and places like that. Why couldn't St Vincent's do Tennant Creek clinical trials? It should be a barrier. Facebook is an interesting one. Have you had experience with recruiting with social media?
We had a trial recently, actually, Catherine's trial, where we did some media for it, and we actually got a fair bit of attention from it. It seemed to spread a bit like wildfire, especially on Facebook. I did see some posts, especially from the hospital. I think that was quite a positive tool that we used, and it really reached out, especially to the epilepsy community of people that are medically resistant to a certain amount of medications, and knowing there is another option out there for it. I think it had a powerful impact. Sure.
Jackie, do you have that discussion from an ethics point of view, looking at technology? And does that come into the discussion very much about recruitment strategies using technology or consent strategies using technology?
It has at times, but then of course maybe with more the augmented with devices that need connection to internet and that kind of size, it's more about, well, who has access? Is access going to be provided? Are we giving equal opportunity to all the people, or are we cutting out a group of perhaps people, more vulnerable people who would not have that opportunity? So it cuts both ways, but I think there's an opportunity too. I think there's also a need if we're going to sort of diverse and try and pick up some more culturally diverse groups, we must understand if maybe face-to-face is more important to them rather than technology. So, and trying to overcome some of their concerns about perhaps, you know, their own sort of understandings of what clinical trials are and you know, so I think we need to just to preface stuff and be culturally sensitive and appropriate around some of the stuff that we're talking about, because I think sometimes people just like to have face-to-face and have a chat with the person who they're doing the trial with, and that's, I think, is a really, really important part, because it's about that relationship and partnering that you're doing with the medical practitioners that you're working with.
That's true. I was considering the idea of, I wonder if clinical trials as a term is a bit of a dirty word. Some of you may remember Lady Susan Renouf died, I think it was last year, with ovarian cancer, and I was really concerned when I read a tribute in the paper, and apparently she was offered the idea of a clinical trial, but she said, quote unquote, "I'm no pharmaceutical company's guinea pig." What do you think of that when you hear that, Wendell or Emma? Because this is some of the perception, this is actually a really strong statement that I think actually comes to the heart of one of the key barriers we have around clinical trials. But the idea of guinea pig, sometimes we say that word and we laugh, but it's actually not a laughing matter.
No, that's true. I've had patients say that to me directly. Like, we're offered them and they go, "You want me to be a guinea pig?" Well, yes, but the treatment you're currently having now, someone was a guinea pig before you, and now it's the standard treatment for you. When you've got to approach it, I guess, in a nice but gentle way, to go, well, yes, things have to start somewhere, and this is where we're starting to try and improve the treatment we give you on the condition that you've got. It's a tricky one, but then there's others who can't wait to be the guinea pig. They're like, "Yep, I'll give that a strong go," like yourself. You're like, "Oh, why not?
I'll do that.
I'll do that. That's fine." Same with Catherine. Happy to be the guinea pig. No guarantees at the end of the day, but it's nice when you get the positives. But yes, you're right. The negatives, you kind of like, don't want you to feel like that. But this is where we're starting.
It's a bit of a two-edged sword, isn't it?
Really
Because there was an article in the paper this weekend talking about trust issues, and that the pharmaceutical industry was the second least trusted sector in the US, and the price of pharmaceuticals, and so clinical trials is part of that mix. So yeah, kind of, do we need to do a makeover on this sector? And if we've only got 3% of oncology patients saying, yes, I'm going to put my hand up for a clinical trial, functionally, realistically, what could we do to make this a more attractive sector? Because once you actually participate in a clinical trial and you understand what it's about, it's enormously successful and attractive. But there is a significant barrier here. Do you have any ideas, Emma? Should we do it, or should we maybe just play the truth card? This is what it is.
A bit of both. I think it does need an overhaul. I think it is a dirty title.
Yeah.
And it doesn't need to be. I haven't worked in clinical trials for that long, and I had a bit of a perception myself of like, oh, I'm not so sure about that. Now I'm into it, I'm like, actually, it's not as bad as what you think. It's for the greater good, end of the day.
Well, that's right, you're part of that. What do you think, Wendell? Does it need a bit of a makeover, or should we play the truth card?
I mean, it's probably the most common thing that people say as a disparaging term when they don't want to be involved in a trial. Like, gosh, I'm just a guinea pig, and it's and it always hurts when they say that. Actually, you think, oh no, you're not a guinea pig, but the reality is we keep on asking patients, and I think one of the key elements is that trusting relationship that you have with your patients, and they so you're always putting to them when things aren't working out. Have you thought about all these X and Y and number of trials that are available, and you feel compelled and obliged to bring that up, although that is quite a common thing that people say, you want me to be a guinea pig, but you just keep on giving them those options. I don't know how to do it. We've tried the Facebook thing as well for, we recently did we're involved in the cannabinoid, the medicinal cannabis trials, and boy, did we have so many people coming for that. And and one of the dilemmas is that we don't know these people when they come through Facebook, and we don't have a trusting relationship with them as well. And so we ended up screening multiple people, and I think only one or two ended up being eligible for the trial. So there is that dilemma of embarking on trial with someone that you don't know, because you end up being not only just their neurologist, you end up being their general practitioner. Every single issue that happens within the trial, it's your responsibility. You know, their cholesterol, their rashes, all these things that happen, because they potentially could be an adverse event. So we end up managing all these things, and so that's a challenge actually. So knowing a person and having that trusting thing is one of the key elements, I think.
But as a trial participant, I think that's one of the marketing things you're actually missing and that you should be using to sell. One of the things when I think about my trial experiences is I get so much access to my healthcare team, you know, for all sorts of things. And I know whenever, even when I'm not on a trial, they're there and they're accessible because I've got a really strong relationship because of my trial participation. It also means there's other bits and pieces that they're looking into that might not have otherwise been considered. So, you know, I'm on a range of different medications as preventatives because I've now got this great relationship with my team that I've developed over years of being a part of trials. So I think you need to market what are the benefits aside from the actual trial, what are the additional benefits that sit outside that? And I think relationship is a key one.
The support you get is amazing.
Huge.
Yeah.
We were talking before about the idea. I made the suggestion, I'd really love it if the clinical trial came to me at my work, because then I'd sign everybody that works up at my place up to a clinical trial. But you can get the blood bus to come and get blood from you at work. Why couldn't you get your clinical trial to come to? That would probably pump the price up. But it would certainly increase enrolment, I reckon. What about there's a lot of misunderstandings about clinical trial, and I get very concerned when people don't understand that if there's a standard treatment available, they'll not get the placebo. And the sense of that this is a clinical trial and you can pull out at any time you like, or that this is a trial in which there are hundreds of other people involved and the monitoring is actually very, very close, and they'll monitor you, ongoing. And the fact that you should tell your GP as well, and you should make sure the rest of your healthcare team knows what you're doing, not just your specialist. But do you think, is there a language problem here as well that we really need to address? As Leanne said, around some of the marketing around clinical trials, maybe it's an education piece. We say this, but we're not actually doing it, are we?
I think there's an opportunity with the new primary healthcare networks and
Okay,
GPs and actually pushing trial information out to potential GPs, so that there is there'd be a better opportunity for sort of a broader range of opportunities of catching people. And I think that also allows GPs to feel like they're actually part of the process and it's not just something done in a tertiary hospital and I'm completely disconnected, or do you know what I mean? I think it's important that we really establish that relationship a little bit stronger, and I think that they are one area that could actually push that information out a lot more.
I tend to agree with you. What if you were sitting in a doctor's surgery and where you got those TV screens and they've got Bold and the Beautiful playing? What if the Bold and the Beautiful was actually Leanne and Catherine? And then we had this whole telly-movie about their clinical trial and their experience. But quite seriously, patient, volunteer and participant stories are really important. Catherine, tell me the experience you've had in your trial. And surely you sit around the dinner table with your family, you might have done this around Mother's Day, and are they learning something from your experience, and how much do you think you've now influenced their knowledge and maybe decision making around trials?
Oh, definitely. I think they're learning a lot about all sorts of things to do with the trial itself and hospitals and Melbourne.
The idea of drug development and how these drugs find their way to the market.
That's right. I mean, I think half of the problem which you were talking about is that it doesn't make it to doctors, clinics that often, and in the country, they might not even hear about trials that are occurring. So if I hadn't have been at the specialist and my parents there at the same time, might not have known about it. So unless people are actively searching out trials, that are available, they might know they exist.
Yeah.
So
It's kind of like the other valley, isn't it? That you've got people that are looking for trials on one hand that are very likely to say yes, and then you've got other people who know absolutely nothing about it and maybe wish they
a healthy
did.
participant that's willing, but they just don't know that they're available or that that's something that they're able to do. You know, maybe you need to look at how do you target them. Well, do you do that at the doctors or
Yeah,
I mean, if
healthy
they're a
participants.
they
Yeah,
don't go to the doctor. But,
yeah,
you
they're
know,
not that healthy if they're at the doctor.
At the sporting club
Through the
or
footy club,
something.
then
At
they're
the
going to be
pub.
healthy specimens. That'd be good
You
for a
need to
clinical
put them
trial.
on coasters at the pub or something. You know.
I love that idea. I think that's
Then
great.
people will sign up.
There you go. That's something to talk about if you're on one of those RSVP dates and you've got a little coaster there. You'd be good for a clinical. You'd be good for a clinical trial. I want to
So
talk about
romantic.
incentives because incentives is really important here. As a healthy volunteer, I got paid to be in a trial, and Jackie, I'm going to jump to you here because this is a hot topic amongst ethics committees, isn't it? How much is enough, and how much is too much? Because you don't want to sway people who are maybe financially insecure.
It is a hot topic. I don't think there is. It is often discussed at our meetings, and I think we don't use the word incentive. We don't even use the word enticement. We don't use words. Reimbursement is the word.
Oh, okay. So incentive's the dirty word.
It is extraordinary. Actually, I almost screamed when you said, "Oh,
Incentive." Yeah.
But it's more about just covering costs, and I think most importantly, and perhaps one of those. As a layperson, when I come in and look at a thing, I want it to be cost neutral at the very least. So if we're talking about how much time does it take in order to pay to ensure car park is paid, childcare is considered, all of those kind of things, it should be cost neutral at the very least. And what is too much, I don't feel like I can honestly say what is too much or too little, but I think if we look at it from the perspective of the person who's coming in and who can give a rough sort of scribble down on this was my shopping list of things I had to pay for today to come in here, I think you should sort of cover these kind of costs. And I think you perhaps look at, you know, Coles vouchers or, you know, Woolworths vouchers, something that can help, you know, pay for the shopping or but is not actually real cash too, because I think that's often an ethical discussion that we've had. So those kind of things, but just it should at the very least be cost neutral.
Except I think there's a whole lot of things that aren't considered in terms of cost and that you can't make cost neutral.
Yeah,
so
that's true.
the time I take off work, I either use my sick leave or my annual leave or my ADOs to participate in trials. That's a financial cost to me. There is then the time that it takes when I'm doing a trial. So it's not just I'm wearing a device. There's all these other bits and pieces I have to do. So I have to keep extra records, or I have to sit there at home and do alertness and cognitive behavioural testing online, and that can take up time. There's no reward for the time that takes out of my day.
You should have a
those
clinical
sorts of things.
research day off, or a number of days off per year as part of carers leave.
It's part of the volunteer thing.
Oh, my work would be so unhappy because I never show up because of all of the time it takes to do this stuff. You know,
I take your point. I think it's a good point.
yeah, I think there's a whole lot of other bits and pieces that just aren't factored into that about, the time cost is certainly one, but there is other elements that come into it that just aren't considered.
But if I can just, I mean, that's valid, but then from my perspective, from someone who's doing it because it's no option, money hasn't come into it for me. Having said that, my parents have spent a lot of money driving me back and forth from the country and supporting me and cooking for me, so I've spent no money, so it's easy for me to say. But I probably didn't even factor cost.
And like I said, for me,
into
I
it
don't,
at
but
all.
I do know of other people where it's like,
Oh,
actually, I
absolutely.
can't afford to
It's-
take that sort of time off.
I mean, I've
And so
only
you lose
just taken it
people.
on board right now that we're talking about it. And now I want to be paid.
You're coming on my Ebola trial, After you get well, you come with me. I'll set you up with a nice trial. But it is quite a hot topic of how much you get paid. I spoke to a journalist at the Age last year, and he did an article about clinical trial participation, and he used me as his guinea pig. But he actually made the analogy that you could do a clinical trial and get paid the same amount of money as working at McDonald's per hour. So which one would you prefer your kid to do, work at McDonald's or do a clinical trial? And I thought that was a really dangerous conversation to have, particularly because I've got a 17-year-old and he wants a car. And he doesn't want to work at McDonald's. And it's like, well, yeah. And then what do I say to that kid? But it's interesting thinking about that. The other thing we see all the time, particularly on social media and in the media, that somebody's raising money to get overseas to get into a clinical trial. And so the confusing messages that come with that, the idea of, and I'm particularly thinking about stem cell tourism and what that means, it's a really dangerous place. The conversation is littered with misconceptions. And I think one of the first things we should do in this sector is clean that up and get somebody to do a bit of dust and polish on the way that we talk about clinical trials and the stories that we tell. I also want to talk about incentives for companies to come to Australia. So Australia is a very attractive place to do clinical trials because we've got things like, and I can say this incentive, the R&D tax incentive, but it's also the quality of our systems here, the infrastructure that we have at hospitals like St Vincent's, and it's the trained staff like Emma and the participation of people like you who have built their whole careers now in the clinical trial sector. How do we ensure that there is a will from government in particular to keep this clinical trial sector alive? And if government was listening, and somebody is good enough to tweet this for me, what's your message to government, Emma? This is your stage. Wow, get us started. How much time have we got? Yeah, we've got about 3 minutes. So. So we're talking about the Medical Research Future Fund, we're talking about the Translation Fund, and the opportunities now to make sure we have a commercial or a translational outcome for a lot of the research that's funded in this country. When do we start talking about clinical trials, and what's the message to government about the clinical trials sector?
Put me on the spot for this one.
I know, making you really work for it tonight, aren't we?
Yeah, sweetening.
Segue. I guess, well, from a personal perspective, because we do so many great clinical trials in Australia, and being a person who's just kind of come onto them in the last year, I feel it's very much underfunded. Obviously, the sponsor is where we get our main funding from, hence that's why I have a job. But from a government perspective, to fund them efficiently and well so that we can get the motor going, essentially. Yeah. Get the ball rolling so we can continue on, not just for year incentives, just make them longer, make them ongoing. Is probably like my biggest drive.
Because not every sponsor is a big pharmaceutical company with a huge big bucket of cash out the back room. Sometimes they're really tiny startup biotechs that are raising money from families, friends and fools to fund clinical trials, and they often don't work, they don't go anywhere. And I think there is a real misunderstanding that government sometimes don't see the opportunity in this. What would you say, Wendell, as a neurologist, as a specialist in this space and a trial advocate, what's the message you would give to government about our infrastructure and keeping it alive here in Australia?
Gosh, it's a question I hadn't really considered, but until you
Oh, I'm so glad. There you go, I stumped you.
Yeah. So I'm glad I've had the opportunity for Emily to
Yeah, you had a minute. But I actually think it's really important that our medical profession have a stake in this conversation. It shouldn't be left up to hospitals.
Because, in neurology, we've been advocating for this around the world and trying to show the benefits of our doctors and our systems to diagnose people appropriately in a similar manner as well. We've got a very strong consistency of diagnosis as well as the way we manage patients as well. So we've been sort of doing this overseas for a while now on our own backs to try and get more trials here and get more early trials here because it is of benefit to downstream things. We get drugs and new devices earlier, and then they become integrated within our treatment modes much earlier on. And so for example, the cannabinoid study, which I was talking about, we're the only country in the world that had this new gel preparation. It's because of our cohesiveness and our ability to promote ourselves as good doctors and good systems to manage this. Because one of the big issues internationally is that they're finding around the world, and they're going to places that I don't want to say disparaging things, but in certain countries who don't have access to drugs are really keen to get these new drugs there, and they're countries which put patients on drugs who don't necessarily need to be on that in trials. And so what they call this placebo rate around the world is getting bigger and bigger. And one of the reasons potentially is the fact that, you know, the diagnostic acumen and the incentives for people being on these new drugs is at a different level in other countries. And so I think places like America, where a lot of our trials come from, are realising that and realising the benefits of Australia and its system. So having government be advocates for this for us at a higher level internationally would be a benefit, I think.
That's really well said. I hope somebody captured that in a really clever tweet. I think because one of the differences, I think, is the so what factor. So what if we did not have places like St Vincent's that had a first-class clinical trial opportunity? What if we did not have people like Emma who had the expertise and the education to do this? What if we did not have Leanne, Catherine and Jackie who are not prepared to participate? Because if we did not have this system in Australia, if we have this diminished or reduced in any way, patients suffer. Do you agree with that, Leanne?
Oh, absolutely. Just give me a moment of horror thinking,
What
if it wasn't for patients, and I'm sure trial processes were very different back in the day of Banting, but if we didn't have trial participants, I wouldn't be here.
Really?
Simple.
What do you think, Catherine? What if this opportunity was not available to you? What if not St Vincent's? What if not Victoria?
She's having one of her ad breaks, as we
Yeah,
like to call
that's
it.
right. I'm going to throw it to you, Jackie.
I think we would be in a far worse place. I think we would be sadly falling behind, and I think that the opportunities that people are getting now would be we wouldn't be able to give some hope to people who've been told there really is no other option other than, and I think that's, you know, the fact that we give that opportunity and to allow that, I think it's really important. And I think that if we had it without, it would be tragedy, and it would be tragic for us as a country to allow ourselves to slip backwards.
We'd just be relying on other countries for their technologies. And
Are we happy to do that? Yeah, no. Yeah, I think that's a really valid point because of the quality of our ethics system and the quality of our infrastructure and healthcare providers. We don't want particularly contentious trials to be taken overseas into other countries that maybe don't share the quality systems that we have yet. And maybe they will.
And then
but
the
for
time
right
it
now,
takes, like if they are successful overseas, the time it takes to become a standardised treatment, and then for our general public to be able to access that takes years.
It does take years. I want to speak on behalf of the pharmaceutical companies and the biotech companies out there, because if this opportunity was not available at St Vincent's, where would they go? So that money that they are spending in creating these trial opportunities and paying Emma's wage and creating great infrastructure, where does that go? Does that go overseas? Speaking on behalf of medical researchers, you want to see the clinical pathway in front of you. Surely. Do we have clinical researchers or medical researchers in the audience? I know we've got some scientists here. Put your hand up. Truly, don't you? You want to see this play out in your hometown if you can. Many medical researchers have relationships with patients and patient advocacy groups. Many medical researchers are funded by those advocacy groups to continue their medical research. So to be able to pay back into that system, having an ecosystem which brings clinicians, researchers, developers in the companies and clinical trial participants together, surely the closer we can bring that system, the better it will be for everybody. I want to finish by saying thank you. Thank you for listening to this conversation, and thank you very much for caring, because clinical trials really do matter. And to me, I feel like I bang the drum about this all the time, but it's never enough. And what I want each of you to do is to go away from this discussion tonight and take this discussion to your dinner table with your children or with your parents or your colleagues at work tomorrow around the lunch table. And I want you to ask this question based on their experience and background. So what if we did not have a clinical trials sector that we do have here in Victoria? What if we did not have the volunteers that put their hand up, for the trial coordinators like Emma, and also healthcare providers like Wendell, and lay people on ethics committees prepared to give their time and their intellectual capacity to this? What if we didn't? Would medical researchers not stay? Would they leave? Would they not be satisfied? What would happen to funding? What would happen to hospitals like St Vincent's and the opportunity there? What would happen to young healthcare professionals as they're coming up through the ranks and the access they can get into what drug development really means and clinical trials mean? So I want you to ask that question. Just think about that. What if we didn't have this? If we don't fight for this, if we don't advocate for it, what will happen? I want to say thank you very much, Tam, for inviting me to this soapbox. That's nice of you to do that. But in particular, I'd like you to join me in thanking each of our participants on the stage here tonight, bringing their experience and opinions. I also want to say thank you to Convergence Science Network. Luan is up the back there. He's the brains behind these operations, and they happen all over the city, and they're extraordinary opportunities to engage. For many of you that have taken the time out here tonight, this is our way of saying thank you to you. Thank you. Sure, we can take questions. I don't think we have a roving mic. We do. Oh, there you go. Put your hand up if you've got a question. Here we go. We've got 3 right there. Let's start with the gentleman on the end, then Sophia and the gentleman in front.
This is, I think, as much to the 2 participants, but also Jackie. Is one of the great byproducts of clinical trials hope? It's giving hope into the community. And hope will often keep people alive and keep them going and keep trying. And is that what comes out of being involved in a clinical trial? That you're providing hope?
Yeah, that's a great comment. Do you want to answer that, Leanne? Why don't we start with you?
I was going to say, yeah, I think Catherine and I
And
probably
Catherine,
have slightly
yeah, both
different
of you.
views because we're in trials for different sort of reasons. For me, it's not so much hope, and I don't know how much the sort of trials that I do necessarily get publicised to the broader community. It's just all of a sudden there's TGA approval and yay, we've got a new device. For me, participating in trials is maybe a little bit of incentive to keep my own health on track and to keep working on these sorts of things. So it's a very individual level, but I don't know how much that necessarily broadens out. I'm very engaged with, again, online communities. And trial participation is not a really big topic in that area, nor is approval processes around, you know, the mechanics, I suppose, of managing a chronic condition. Drugs maybe. Sometimes. There are times when, you know, it can drive you mad as well. But, you know, by and large it keeps me positive, but occasionally trials can be a bit onerous as well.
Yeah, Catherine?
Yeah, I would agree with that.
It's not all rainbows and sunshine, is it?
No.
Not always, but yeah, it does. It gives you hope when otherwise there wasn't, you know, many other options. So, yeah.
I'd
Very
also
true.
agree with that. Another trial that I'm on, the 16 patients that I've met and their families, the key, and they're terminal, the key reason they've signed on is hope and time.
Time.
That's all it is.
By a little bit of time. Sophia, you're next, and then in the front there.
I'm going to follow that up with, this is not doing anything. I'm going to follow that up with a technical question, just to bring on. That was really good. That was a really good question. I feel terrified to follow it. But essentially, like, I'm really interested in clinical trials. I would love to be a volunteer in one, but unfortunately I'm not healthy. Like, I can't be a healthy volunteer. I have chronic depression that's managed really well. Like, I'm on medication that makes me better, but that still stops me from being a healthy volunteer. And that, I find that really frustrating. And I was wondering, like, do you think that that's possibly a reason that there's lower like uptake of healthy volunteers? Like you get chronic healthy volunteers who come back again and again and again. But do you think like that barrier of essentially like having one illness that stops you from ever being engaged as a healthy volunteer, do you think that that's like a notable barrier? And do you think there are any ways we can kind of bring that barrier down?
I'm going to agree and say I think exclusion criteria for some of that stuff is actually a bit ridiculous. I have chronic depression. I'm on research trials, so why can't other people be? You know, I do think there's some really weird ins and outs of what you can and can't do with medical trials that for me as a layperson just don't make a whole lot of sense.
And then there's sponsor dependent as well. A couple of sponsors that I get to work with are quite reasonable in that for some of my patients, especially in Convergence trial, I've been able to obtain waivers for exactly what you're talking about.
Not so healthy people.
Not so healthy people. Because they've seen, on the whole, yes, they fit the criteria, yes, they've got this single issue, it's being managed, they're okay with that. So I think it's child dependent as well.
And down the front there, and then with the hat, yes.
The promotion of clinical trials has been around well over a couple of decades. I've been involved in it since the early 2000s. Surely someone somewhere has done a socio-economic impact analysis because that's the way governments think.
Yeah.
And it should be fairly easy to justify investment if you've got a positive socio-economic impact analysis. Has someone done one?
I hope so. If anyone knows, please pass
Surely
it to
this
Tam. Yeah, surely somebody knows. I completely agree. It should be an easy argument to make when you can see
Not a
there's
terribly
a
hard piece of
significant.
work to
Yeah,
do.
no, it's not. No, it's not. That's a good thing to fund. Yes. Now, the man in the hat. See, aren't you glad you wore a hat? Yeah, there you go. Yeah, you always get given the microphone if you wear a hat.
Thank you very much for an interesting conversation and discussion. There's one side of clinical trials which wasn't brought up and discussed. And that's when a person who wants to be in a trial because their treatment is not working and they are rejected. How is that treated? And how are their psychological states and emotional states considered in advising that rejection?
Wendell or Emma, could you answer that?
It's difficult. I think that, you know, the trials often are done for regulatory purposes, and so they have these really stringent criteria. And, you know, we do think about that when we put people up for trials, and then when they get knocked back, we try and argue with the sponsor. And depending on what the sponsor is like, I mean, we usually fail, actually, to be honest, because they have these regulatory requirements that say we're just going to exclude these people. I wonder on one or two occasions, and one was a patient who had depression, and it was used as an exclusion criteria, and I argued that, and there was, you know, it was a tricky situation where the person also had some suicidal intent as well when they were brought up for the trial. But in her past, when bad news was given to her, she would also potentially become unwell and have difficulties with coping with that. So I argued that excluding her from the trial would make her worse as well once we'd put her up for the trial, and we argued successfully in that instance, which is a difficult thing to balance the risk, and also the one of the correlates is that we in fact don't have any things that we do things for benevolent reasons, not for malevolent, and so there was this risk that we had to assess, and we won that. But most often we don't with trials because they are very fixed and unmoving in their exclusion and inclusion criteria.
The case I'm thinking of is a friend whose daughter has got cancer. It's terminal, eventually she'll die. And it's for cancer treatment that she applied for, but she was excluded. Don't know the reasons why, but she was very much attempting to get in there and do something because there's nothing else to be done.
I'm glad you raised that point because it is a very important part here when people are excluded. And my advice is to keep applying, because there are various trials that happen in certain therapeutic areas, and it won't be the last trial. But it does have an impact when people are prepared to put their hand up, and we often don't talk about that, do we?
Thanks. Hello. Thank you.
Speak out loud. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. That was really interesting. I didn't really know anything about clinical trials before coming here, and I feel extremely enlightened. I want to follow up on a point that you mentioned on inclusion. And I think language isn't the only barrier when it comes to reaching out to other cultural groups, generally more diverse sort of group of people. I think a lot of people who are from other countries, we are blessed with a very multicultural society. They don't even have clinical trials as something to consider in their everyday life where they come from. So it's very hard for them to imagine that this is at all safe, that this is at all a good thing.
Yeah.
It's very much outside of what they consider normal. Maybe things will change in the future, but for now, how do we reach out to those people to make this, again, like a more friendly option, an option that more diverse, more culturally diverse, and generally more diverse people can go for?
I think that's a really tough question. Yeah.
It is.
But that's how we get more diversity. Yeah.
Yeah. So, for example, I'm from Greece. Like a lot of the elderly Greek population might need to jump onto clinical trials, but I think a lot of times they're scared. They don't know what it is and the good benefits. So yeah, how do we include more cultural backgrounds?
No, that's a very good comment.
Michelle, can I just jump into that?
Sure.
In terms of culturally diverse population, we've actually at St Vincent we've got various projects going in terms of promoting that, and there's a talk tomorrow on that as well in terms of our current sort of strategy to improve that in terms of trial uptake. But I would encourage you, in terms of the consumer, the community, and you might have seen our banner out there in terms of, you got to actually ask the doctors as well. So our approach is in terms of really having that, in terms of educating, in terms of staff who are not wanting to do trials, but at the same time, it's from the consumers who are asking for that opportunity. So don't wait until you've got no other options. Be sort of proactive as well. And certainly, at St Vincent's, we are supporting in terms of that level of consumer and community engagement, through events like this. And hopefully, it's going to be an ongoing sort of activities on an annual basis, having the conversation.
I guess too, as our healthcare providers are coming from more diverse backgrounds and we have a greater multicultural mix in our healthcare providers, that option becomes maybe a little easier. There was a lady up the back, yes?
I just want to mention about funding for clinical trials, because basically it all comes down to funding at the end of the day. So in Victoria, in the Department of Health, there is a group who've been working on streamlining ethics, which you may have heard of. And they've done a lot of work over the last 5 years in the ethics area, and that was just to try and promote Victoria in particular, but I think it's also part of a bigger strategy. Tam will know about that, for the country to try and attract clinical trials to Australia. They've done quite a lot of work now in that area, and things have sped up quite a bit. So we are getting quite a lot of trials. However, the workforce within clinical trials is really difficult. So no coordinator, to my knowledge, has a permanent position. All of them are on one-year contracts, and that is really not very encouraging, particularly for nurses who can have a full-time permanent job anywhere in the country. So if you're trying to get a decent nurse to be in that role, then that's quite difficult. So the Department of Health in Victoria will be working on this in the coming, I think, maybe years. It's not going to happen immediately, but it is part of their plan to make sure that sites are better looked after. So I think that's an encouraging.
Thank you for that. That's it. Oh, wow, that's fascinating. Is that true, Emma, that they're on
First
1 year?
I've heard of it. That's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a concern, because if there's no security in the workforce, how can we create a really good, strong, permanent, robust system? Yeah, that's a very important point. Thank you for that.
Can I make a quick funding point that relates back to the cultural and linguistically diverse population? I'd encourage anyone writing a clinical trial to write in funding for translation of information. That's a barrier. It costs a huge amount to translate literature, and that's part of why people don't engage with the cold population. So I think you should actually put it in your funding bids.
You know, actually, a translator for companies that, well, for like the Department of Health, and I help translate brochures for health services. I've never come across any
clinical trials.
Clinical trials.
There you
And they're excluded because of the cost.
Yeah, the cost. Yeah, the cost. And I think there was another question. Yes, this lady in the blue. Go ahead.
Just going back to the mental illness side of it, if mental illness is such a comorbidity of a lot of the things that you're trialing, why are they always excluded? Yeah, I don't know if anyone can actually answer that, but like from here. But shouldn't they be?
Emma, can you answer that?
They haven't specified, sponsors haven't specified to me particularly, but my guess would be compliance to make sure that, because when patients sign a consent, they're signing up that they can attend all the appointments necessary for that particular trial, so we can gather the information and the data we need to make sure that whatever treatment we are providing is working. And sometimes patients have been known with, unfortunately, mental health illnesses that they don't have great compliance when it comes to something. That would be one thing that came to mind for me.
So they're not excluded, because it is so common, with up to 24% of the population having depression at one point in time. They're not, and anxiety and a number of the other conditions as well. So they're not excluded usually. It's only if they're considered to be at immediate risk that then they're much more stringent in that, and we have to screen people for that. And certainly in all epilepsy trials, where we have to screen for their risk of suicide, that would be the biggest exclusion for mental illness actually. But otherwise, no, because it's so common.
Yes, this lady in the green.
So I was just curious, you said that there's quite a high rate of trials that don't get the required enrolment. So what actually happens to those trials? Do you change the requirements for enrolment, or do they just not go ahead? Or?
They generally, speaking from a pharmaceutical biotech perspective, they don't go ahead in that site. So you may have Adelaide and Perth and Singapore and, LA as your listed trial sites. And if Melbourne can't recruit, just doesn't go ahead in Melbourne. So that's the unfortunate thing there often. Anybody else got any other perspective on that? What happens?
That's right. They're just multi-centre studies, and so they're what they call competitive recruitment. So you have a certain amount of time to recruit patients into a study, and there'd be quite small, narrow windows as well, actually. And they might want to recruit, say, like 180 people worldwide. So, and they'll give you 4 months or 6 months to do that. And so you just won't have any patients at your site.
Yes, and that man in the blue?
I was wondering about the reimbursement. You mentioned that it should be cost neutral.
Yeah.
But I can imagine that also a big part of participating in a clinical trial is the risk you take, especially when you're a healthy individual. Now, on the one hand, I can imagine you want to be reimbursed for that, but on the other hand, you don't want to incentivize people to take medical risk just for the money. So how do you deal with issues like that? Do you take the risks into account in the discussions?
So typically we deal with in patients, not in healthy volunteers. And so, obviously the part of the informed consent is there, and perhaps, Michelle, you can comment on that when you've gone through a trial as a healthy participant. And I guess you do get that balance. So there's one, a healthy volunteer, and sort of as a patient. So, and that's the difference. So we don't tend to look at the healthy volunteer first in healthy volunteer trial.
Yeah, I can probably shed some light. So the trial that I did was over at the Alfred, and it was an outpatient study, and it was over just a year that it went, and it involved 22 visits, 8 injections, and I got paid $1,300, which was considered to be reimbursement for my time. When I think about what I'm paid per hour in my job, it didn't cover that. But when I got into the trial, there were something like 230 participants in Australia in the trial, and we're all being dosed at the same time. Most of the people in the phase 1 clinical trial unit were young men. And there was groups of them, because we would see each other at the same visit, and there was a group of 4 young blokes who were all doing law at Melbourne University, and they were doing a collaborative assignment together. And so they were actually staying in the unit. And this one bloke said to me that it was a 14-day inpatient study, so they're locked into the unit, they can't leave, they have to stay, and they were being paid $3,500 for that. So he was planning to go to Thailand after that. And then there was another young bloke, and he was funding his startup company with that. So it's interesting. I think the idea of reimbursement for healthy volunteers is actually a really interesting discussion, why people do it. And this young bloke that was starting up his company, he was a serial phase 1 volunteer. I think he'd done it about 8 times, and he reckons he earned about $30,000 that year doing clinical trials. I think that's about it. Thank you very much. I'm going to let you go home on this almost winter's night. Thanks again to our panel, to Tam and St Vincent's and Convergence Science Network. Thank you.